Originally, I thought to try and narrate my experience getting to Portugal and being there and all of that. And I thought that all of these videos and pictures and photos would also likewise contribute to that. But what I'll do instead is I'm going to read a little bit of my narrative essay on the Afrocentric perspective of Portugal. And hopefully from that you garner a little bit of understanding. Living in an age that is actively delegating that which
Hoje
contributes
não
to
será
propaganda. This is an issue when one finds a challenge, for example, but system structures, organizations, and policies set up to address said challenge find themselves rescinded to manipulate the existence of said challenge. You become unsure of how to move forward, and I think that's the point. This is something that is breathing and growing fangs and claws within the polarization and politicization of the social historical context of identity and culture, including whether or not the two are worth keeping books about. Azulejos are glazed ceramic tiles that often capture the history and daily life of myth and actuality in blue and white within Portugal. Seeing them covered in histories of colonialism, king's nationalism, and religion kept wanting to see me. However, different beliefs and practices in society prevented perceiving African people as part of Portuguese society. Due to the pervasive nature thereof within the abolition of slavery in the mid 1800s. In their age of discovery, quote unquote, of other cultures and people, the violence, brutality, and record of that was destroyed. Thus, in not knowing the history of the African peoples, who not just influenced Portugal's contemporary society, but supplied their contemporary socio-cultural context, Portugal's nationalism has been allowed to piecemeal the Afro-Portuguese experience and legacy as one of pride and racial mixing, quote unquote. This had allowed them to absolve themselves from how they actively contributed to the pioneering and development of the legacy of the transatlantic slave trade, including the impact that it continues to have on society. After finding that there were Portuguese people who had not integrated into society even after generations in Portugal, there has been and continues to be work to address the problems associated with social, economic, and legal mobility in Portugal's society. Why? Therein lie extant cosmologies that make the inculcation of the African person subaltern. Throughout my cultural research journey in Portugal, I realized the reproduction of the United States mannerisms of knowing history and moving on from it was not there. It made me ask myself, why do we need to suggest moving on when we discuss or refer to historical accounts? It made me realize within myself, as Black people, I feel like we often live our past and future right now. Hence, I offer my own account, Kula, Black American woman, entrenched in the activism of decolonizing the mind from where the institutions of slavery all started. The African people there still look like the African people here. And I experienced a double consciousness with the record of my own. Dear expat, you're welcome to
Hoje não será
an economic migrant. Because with all you had before, there is no way the better opportunity could be here. No. We see you as one who creates opportunity. With your mass social capital, of course you will feel safe here. When you do not understand the words and metaphors and slang being used to discuss your Black body and the space you occupy, read, take up, when you do not understand your privilege and how your birth country affords you the niceties and pleasantries you perceive in a nation that profited off of the subjugation of those before you and beside you, of course you will love it there. Of course you will visit multiple times a year. You surely did not fall asleep next to me, but I will charge myself to wake you. In Cuba, people ate up the no racism dialogue, and similar things happen in Portugal. It is actively more dispelled in Brazil and the US that racism cannot pervade systematically and socially. The African American expats that I met were more invested in aesthetics and histories, contexts, their own implications, and possible impositions being in Portugal. They posited views that contributed to Portugal's exceptionalism and sidestepped the power dynamics of social capital, i.e., social mobilities, for themselves, compared to African peoples born there. This included the opportunity to cash in on the housing market, anchor businesses in their technology sector, and retire there. It was with this economic privilege. It was with this opportunity and privilege I did not just come to comprehend the necropolitics of Portugal as not just a devaluation of rights, that is, dictating how some may live and how some may die, must die, in the throes of capitalism, but the protection of rights for someone with the economic standing to be considered an expat and not an economic or labor migrant. Conceptualization of Portuguese exceptionalism. Russo-tropicalism refers to what Gilberto Freire, a Brazilian sociologist, identified as a way to justify Portuguese colonialism as different, quote unquote, more harmonious colonialism that involved making alliances and developing multiracial relationships. This was one of the many strategies of occupation for the small country, with disordered term leading to different racialized power dynamics. Other strategies include the use of African and indigenous peoples to navigate these stars, etc. And when they find these places and peoples, no credit is given to them. A part of blatant erasure, African biologists would be asked for plant names and they would be recorded in Latin nomenclature to uranize names and quote unquote discover uses.
Pois não será.
Specialized in kidnapping and human trafficking. Numbers underreport their impact and involvement in transatlantic slavery. In addition to physically stratifying people across the world, they work to disparage and denigrate the black body by placing people in human zoos, thus contributing to their racial, social, cultural devaluation. Portuguese language and literature maintains formulas that place African bodies in civilizational inferiority. Phrases, proverbs, words, metaphors, and old myths to classify Africans as terrorists, cannibals, and savages. The same bodies and minds that they called lazy produce Al-Andalus, black confraternities and brotherhoods, African proto-nationalist movements, anti-colonialist movements, African immigration associations, and black anti-racist movements. It comes to reparations for the development of somatic and social prejudice for the Portuguese, different ideological thoughts, especially with reparations, somewhat an apology, and somewhat money. Ultimately, we have to ask what reconciles us the most, and will it be enough to just have a symbol without reconciling how race itself is an enslaved continuity. Symbolic reparations are also performative activism, and we have to do more than agree with epistemologies that perpetuate capitalism and scarcity. We must acknowledge the propaganda driving that which we think are our choices. Propaganda is an art form. Messages and museums. In contemporary discussions about Euro-colonial heritage, history, memory, and post-memory, they have become important to political relevance and questioning the historiographical, political, and social contract under which we are living. I passed a lot of 19th century written and pictorial colonial messages that have strong anti-Black prejudice, whether this was scientific campaigns to assert colonial power disguised as mission trips, pacification campaigns that followed exploitation, domination, and resistance, or the context in obtaining citizenship in Portugal that verbally ascertained whether you were savage or civilized. The work done for the construction of colonial territory and the deconstruction of nature in African cultures must be remembered, is what I learned. It did not surprise me that the denial of slavery, the denial of the avid contribution to, and the pioneering of the development and legacy of the transatlantic slave trade by Portugal, nor the way the Estado Novo provides the ideology to justify colonial violence and imperial reorganization of Lisbon's urban spaces. It is not surprising that they do
Pues no será.
birth to contemporary society and the interactions within it. It did not surprise me that influence is an understatement. They introduced fat, gasoils, the irrigation, and the sewer systems. They are not Moors. A lot of the people that we met had parents, or they themselves had the experience or resident of growing up in a fascist regime that denigrated histories that didn't fit their quote unquote supreme great country colonizer image that they wanted to build during the 40 years of dictatorship. Thus, there is a lack of historical context that is capable of commemorating the incomplete development of worldviews. We are living in colonial continuities, and I got to meet Black folk in Portugal who overcame their identity crisis. I overcame my identity crisis. Even I second guessed how I felt in the city. Racism is subtle, and you just feel it sometimes. Gestures, actions, and choices. I watched a majority of people who do not see it, so the majority do not believe that it could possibly be there, even though it would or could be or is there. Our requiem. Within Portugal, I realized the commercialization of activism and how much more resistance exists in media, art, and music. Music is not just a form of protest, but a way to understand space and the design of space, power relations. Music is confrontation and memory and a way of being. You can't speak of hip hop without speaking of slavery. You can't speak of the Haitian Revolution without the drums. Music is a way of being. You can follow music to understand more about gender roles, politics, oppression, slavery, etc. The changes that colonialization brought. Resistance in music and being able to move your body. Music as therapy to survive and carry knowledge. What does that all mean? Fado is not just the Afro-Portuguese version of the blues. It is a way of historicizing Portugal if we pay deep intentional attention. Fado has been so commercialized that they forgot that to speak of Fado is to speak of Mukombo, to speak of the way Fado got depoliticized and repoliticized for the chauvinistic sense of belonging of the white Portuguese. And you must speak of those profiting off of the black bodies who look to Portugal for Fado, now West Africa, and that is by design. In my own way, the resistance is writing all this down. I have seen the impact of developing a counter-narrative with toponymic plaques, doing art in a way that decolonizes society and lets folk not just imagine the future, but tap dance the present and reflects. Many think discussing slavery is regressing and quote-unquote going back.
Pues no será.
Some of them teach them, as if it were not directly introduced. They never mentioned the transatlantic slave trade unless they were discussing their hand within their great maritime technologies, which they also never mentioned being crafted and guided by African bodies, by African people, by African culture and life. They talk about their castles and infrastructure and cobblestones as if it all popped up at some time or two, not the potential labor behind it. Never the black body, never the black mind, and surely never absolute subjugation. I offer you this, my honorable mention.